Hey guys, welcome back to Coach Hall Writes. In today's video, we're going to be talking about how to write a rhetorical analysis essay for the AP Lang exam. Before we get started, I wanted to take a quick second to let you guys know about a top secret project I've been working on behind the scenes. I've been working on a rhetorical analysis ebook to help teachers and students master rhetorical analysis because, quite frankly, rhetorical analysis is my jam. So if you want more information about this ebook, be sure to check out the description box below. It's really important to understand the task. You need to know what a rhetorical analysis essay is before you actually try to write one. So basically, for a rhetorical analysis essay, you're looking at a nonfiction passage. It could be an article, a speech, a letter, or even an excerpt of a nonfiction text. So what you're going to be doing is looking for how the writer makes rhetorical choices to develop an argument, achieve a purpose, or convey a message. Now, if you just heard the term rhetorical choices and you're like, wait a minute, Coach Hall, I don't know what that is, let me try to break it down for you guys. So first of all, a rhetorical choice is usually conveyed through a verb. It's something that the writer does. Now, there are some really common rhetorical choices like repetition, so the author might repeat a certain word, or maybe they contrast things in a meaningful way, or compare things, so those are all choices. However, sometimes the choices are actually a little bit more broad, or maybe they're just like a little bit less common. So it could be that they're creating an enemy, or maybe they're flattering their audience, or criticizing their audience, or maybe they're trying to justify something. So those are all choices as well. So it's really important to try to use active verbs to convey what the writer is doing. When you start thinking about the body paragraphs of a rhetorical analysis essay, you're going to need to plan to have evidence and commentary. This actually amounts to 4 of a possible 6 points on the AP Lang rubric. So evidence can come in a couple different forms. It can be a direct quote, which means that you directly quote from the passage. In this case, you want to embed these quotes. Don't just drop them in, work them into a sentence. You also want to make sure that it's a shorter quote. It doesn't even have to be a complete sentence because you can weave it into a sentence of your own. Sometimes I think students choose longer quotes because they think it's going to make their essay look longer and therefore better, but that's actually counterproductive. In addition to embedding a short quote into a sentence of your own, you can also include evidence by using a paraphrase. So basically, when you paraphrase something, you take the writer's words and you put them into your own words. Although evidence is really important because you do need to engage with the text, you want to limit your evidence just a little bit because you want more commentary than evidence. So commentary is going to be your analysis. It's how you explain the significance of the evidence to help prove your thesis. It's basically your insight into the text, your own original thoughts. And so for commentary, there are a couple tips. You want to really think about why the writer made that choice. So whatever it is you're analyzing, think about why the author did that. So why did they make that choice for that audience on that occasion? If you're trying to develop your commentary, just keep asking yourself why and how. Really dig into the effect of that choice and the intentions behind it. Also think about the structure. So why did they make that choice at that particular point in the passage? Because writers do things with intention. So we want to really examine why they're doing what they're doing. When you approach the prompt itself, you want to slow down. The prompt is usually pretty short. It looks like a couple sentences. So sometimes I think students gloss over it because they're ready to tackle the passage. However, if you read the prompt too quickly, you're likely going to miss valuable information. The prompt likely tells you multiple elements of the rhetorical situation. So it's going to tell you who the writer or speaker is. It might even give you their credentials. Also, it's going to tell you who the audience is, especially if it's a letter or a speech, because those are usually directed at a very concrete group of people. Now, if it's an article, there might not be as much of an obvious audience in the prompt, but they might tell you where the article was published. And sometimes you can make some inferences about audience for that. Again, it might tell you the passage type. You need to know what you're about to read. So is it a letter, a speech, an article? What type of speech is it? Or is it the introduction of something, the conclusion of something, or is it an excerpt? All these little details matter as you approach the passage. You should also look for details about the context and or the exigence. So context, I like to think of it as historical context. So when was this written? And then what do you know about that period of time? Also, the exigence is kind of like the catalyst. It's what prompted the writer to write or the speaker to speak. So were they invited to speak? Are they speaking because a certain event happened? Are they responding to a letter that they received? These could all be the exigence. Lastly, they might include a hint about the purpose, the message, or the argument. Now, I say hint because they might give you something like her message of perseverance. Now, that gives you a clue, but you need to actually dig deeper as you read the passage to figure out more about why that's her message and like what her message truly means. Since we just talked about looking for elements of the rhetorical situation in the prompt itself, I thought I would give you guys a quick example of how you could break down a prompt. So this is actually a prompt that I created for my own students, but if you want to take a second to pause the video and read it, you're welcome to. So we have the prompt here in blue, and then on the side, I just noted different elements of the rhetorical situation. After you've read the prompt, you need to move on to the passage, and you want to actively read the passage, which means that you should be annotating the passage as you read. Now, you might be wondering, okay, but what am I looking for? I recommend looking for rhetorical choices. Remember, that's what the writer is doing. And with your annotations, it can be helpful to note the actual choice, either in the margin or in the comments, depending on if you're doing it by hand or digitally. Find a system that works for you. As you start to note major rhetorical choices, you also want to be thinking about the purpose of that choice. So basically ask yourself, why did the writer make this choice? Really also think about the structure as well. So how are these choices working together to help the author achieve his purpose or convey his message or develop his argument? Now, as you read, you also might want to start looking for evidence because you know you need evidence in your essay anyway. However, I would caution you not to over-underline things because sometimes that gets really sloppy. And if everything is underlined, then it's really hard to figure out, okay, where was that one quote that I liked? So be a little bit more sparing with that type of annotations. Words in the margin sometimes are a bit more helpful. Also, if it's something super important that you want to remember, maybe put a star by it or something. That way it draws your attention to it later. I wanted to show you guys a couple ways to implement the tips that I just gave you. Now, please keep in mind that for the purposes of this demonstration, I have the paragraph with the annotations underneath it. Now, I know that's not really realistic for the College Board's format because they have their passage in 2 columns, but you guys get the idea. So here, I was looking at the word choice he used in the first paragraph. So I have the word yesterday, and I put a note that says, emphasizes the recent nature of the attack. So I'm trying to use strong verbs as I ask myself, okay, why did he use this word? Also, we've got the phrase suddenly and deliberately attacked. So this time I said that it implies the US could not have prevented this attack. FDR begins to establish Japan as the enemy. Now, if I was doing this in a timed setting, I would probably use a bit more shorthand, but you get the idea. You want to identify what he's doing in this case, why he's using those words, and really use the opportunity to put strong verbs in your annotations because then it actually makes writing your essay a lot easier. I also want to draw your attention to the final bullet point on this slide, and that's because one of the goals of rhetorical analysis is to examine a rhetorical choice in relation to the rhetorical situation. So in this case, I want to think about purpose. I know that his ultimate goal is to ask Congress to declare war. So I'm using that in that sentence there to really be thinking about why is he starting the speech this way? Given that he wants them to declare war, why is he making this choice of creating an enemy at the very beginning of the speech? Another tip for you is to follow the line of reasoning. So the line of reasoning is basically the logical progression of ideas. A writer needs to be convincing, and because of that, they're going to structure their speech or their letter or their article in a very particular way. So that pertains to choices as well. One of the tips I give my students is to divide the passage into chunks or sections. So you might be wondering, okay, well, how do I know where one section begins and another one ends? Well, quite frankly, you're looking for different shifts. Perhaps it's a change in topic, a change in choice, a change in tone. So even if you're getting stuck, think about the beginning, middle, and end. See if you could divide up the passage that way. So when you do that, you are following the author's line of reasoning. So if we do it that way, it becomes less of a scavenger hunt. Sometimes I see students trying to write a rhetorical analysis essay, and they're like, oh, I see repetition. It's in the beginning, the middle, and the end. And then they write a whole paragraph about repetition. And while this isn't necessarily wrong, if you actually look at the line of reasoning and figure out how does the author start, how do they continue, and how do they conclude, that can lead to a stronger essay. It doesn't mean that you can't reference the repetition, but you want to look at things chronologically as opposed to just kind of searching for different choices. So after you annotate the prompt and then the passage and divide it into sections, for me, the next step is to create an outline. Now, I know sometimes students are like, but Coach Hall, I've only got like 40 minutes to write this essay. That's a waste of time. However, I can say from personal experience, because I did take a mock exam with my students, that if you have an outline and you really plan your ideas in advance, it leads to a stronger essay. So this might take a little bit of time, but if you're able to write the essay more quickly because you have a sense of direction, that's going to help you in the long run. I've listed on the slide here some elements that you could include in your outline. Now, if you're pressed for time or if you just get more comfortable with this, you might not need to be as detailed, but I do recommend thinking about your thesis. So what are you trying to prove? And also the main idea of each of your body paragraphs, because that's going to help you figure out what are you trying to focus on and how does it connect to your thesis. I also recommend planning your evidence and commentary. You can shorthand the notes a little bit, but you really need to think about what you're going to say to prove your point. Another tip is to create layers of evidence and commentary. So if you remember on the previous slide, it said evidence, commentary, evidence, commentary. I encourage my students to aim for at least 2 layers, though technically you can do more. And that's because if you just have 1 layer of evidence and commentary, it's not very convincing. And remember, there is an element of argument to rhetorical analysis. You're trying to prove something. You're trying to prove your thesis. So you want to be able to develop your ideas. Oftentimes, if a paragraph only has 1 layer, it's quite underdeveloped. So really focus on how you can use evidence and commentary to truly prove your point. One of the biggest struggles students tend to have when they divide a passage into sections is they're like, I don't know how to write about 3 or 4 different choices all at once. Like, that's really hard. So what you want to remember is that choices don't operate in isolation. They work together. So first ask yourself, okay, what choices do I notice? So in the first section or portion of FDR's speech, I noticed that he had some aggressive word choice. He was also listing different places that were attacked, and there was repetition. So he repeated the word attacked. He also repeated the word deliberate. So those are my major choices. That's what I want to talk about. So then I have to ask myself, okay, what is he doing by making these choices? Well, more broadly, all of these things point to him trying to create a common enemy. So that's going to become my main idea. So instead of focusing on just repetition or just the list, I'm going to focus on trying to prove that he begins his speech by creating a common enemy. So once I've settled on my main idea, then I need evidence and commentary to prove it. So I have 2 layers here. In the first layer, we have the evidence of sudden and deliberate. So that's the word choice I want to analyze. And then the commentary is my analysis of why he makes that word choice. Then my second layer of evidence is that he lists different locations in order to prove that Japan was guilty, that it was premeditated. So that's another choice he makes in order to create a common enemy. And I have my commentary for that too. You're welcome to pause the video if you want to read this a little bit more carefully. I'm going to be really honest. The more I've taught AP Lang, the more I've changed my mind about how I want my students to write an intro. So when I first started, I gave my students the advice that I was given as a high school student. Think about the introduction as an inverted triangle. Start broad, funnel down to specific. So I would tell my students, okay, if you can, try to come up with a hook, a universal truth that starts your essay. Not a rhetorical question, not some kind of quote, not a shocking fact, just a universal truth. Then include some context and your thesis. But my students quickly pointed out that a hook is really hard to come up with when you've only got 40 minutes to write. So I've since decided that my best advice is to at least try to give a bit of context, because quite frankly, you really just need your thesis. You get 1 point for that. But when I've read essays that just start with a thesis, it's kind of like we're diving in right in the moment, and it feels really abrupt. So if possible, use the information in the prompt or the passage or just your outside knowledge to write 1 or 2 sentences of context before that thesis. That leads to a much smoother introduction. Now let's talk about the thesis statement. So in order to be defensible, you need to have a claim that you can prove. Defensible does not mean sophisticated. So there's a whole range of what constitutes defensible. So at the bare minimum, students will sometimes say the author uses repetition in detail in order to, and then they'll tell the purpose. That's defensible. We have two choices there. We have a purpose. However, there are better ways to phrase it with some practice. So really think about including rhetorical choices or rhetorically accurate verbs, and then really think about the true purpose, message, or argument of the actual passage. One of the ways that I have found to help students write a thesis statement more quickly is to give them a sentence frame. So basically a sentence frame is where you plug in your own ideas. Now, I will admit this might seem a bit formulaic, but it's a way for students to quickly express their own ideas. As my students get more comfortable with the sentence frame, then they start to write their own thesis statement that doesn't have a frame at all. But at least if they have the frame memorized, they're able to write something quickly under pressure. Because some people might be unfamiliar with how to use a sentence frame, I decided to include one of the sentence frames that I give my students here. That way you can see the frame and also an example of how to fill in the blanks. Part of the reason that I want my students to be able to write an introduction rather quickly is because the body paragraphs are the most important part of the essay, in my opinion, because that's where you have your evidence and commentary. And remember, that makes up to a possible 4 points out of the 6 points on the AP Lang rubric. So make sure that your body paragraph has a clear point or focus. You need to be trying to prove something in relation to your thesis. You also want to begin to analyze why the writer makes that choice in relation to the rhetorical situation. So why is that choice appropriate for the audience and the occasion? How does the choice help the writer develop their argument? And also, why is the choice effective? These are questions you can ask yourself in order to develop your body paragraph. Another tip I give my students is to make sure that they specify what the message, argument, or purpose is, because it can be really easy to just say, this helps the author to develop their argument. But you want to actually say what the argument is, because otherwise it doesn't seem like you really understood the passage. So sometimes students will ask, but what if I already said what the argument is earlier on? Can I just say argument then? And I tend to lean toward no. I suppose there's always exceptions, but phrase it differently perhaps, but really be as specific as possible to prove to the person reading your essay that you understood the passage. The same concept applies to the word audience. So if you know who the audience is, let's say it's a specific person or group of people, then use that term. Or maybe it's implied, so maybe it's parents. The audience is not really going to be everyone, so be specific, but just saying audience is kind of vague. Also, you don't need to refer to them as the speaker or the writer. Use their actual name. So the first time you reference the person, it's good to use their full name, but then after that, you can just call them by their last name. You don't need to say Mrs. So-and-so. You also don't want to call them by their first name because that kind of seems like y'all are besties and you're not. So don't say writer or speaker or audience either. Be specific. We talked about how to follow the writer's line of reasoning earlier on in this video. So now you need to recognize that when you're writing an essay, you become the writer, so you need to create a line of reasoning. So one way to do this is to include transitions in between the layers of evidence in a paragraph. That's going to help your essay flow better. You also can use your topic sentences of your second body paragraph, or possibly second and third body paragraphs if you go for 3 body paragraphs, to create a line of reasoning as well. So think of it as like a bridge between your paragraphs. We want to avoid phrasing like, another choice the writer makes is. So instead, we want to try to perhaps refer back to the previous main idea and then introduce the new idea. So you could say, having already established that, and then include the previous main idea, the writer, but use their last name, then does, and then talk about the next choice you're going to analyze. So really create those connections to have a smoother essay. Because students only have 40 minutes to write a rhetorical analysis essay on the AP Lang exam, students often wonder, do I need a conclusion paragraph? So my answer is it depends, because I don't think there's one answer that fits everybody. So what does it depend on? First of all, if you have, let's say, 5 minutes left and you are still working on your body paragraph, please finish that body paragraph, because that body paragraph is going to have evidence and commentary, and there's points for that in the rubric. There is nothing in the rubric that says you need a conclusion. Why? Because quite frankly, these essays, for the national exam at least, are viewed as a rough draft. So you don't technically need a conclusion, but there are times when it could help your essay. So let's say that you do have time to write one, even if it's only a couple minutes. What can you do? the first thing you want to do is ask yourself, do I have a defensible thesis? Personally, I like to see the thesis in the intro, but if it's not there, the next place I look is the conclusion. So if you're worried that your thesis wasn't defensible the first time, rewrite your thesis. So don't copy it word for word from your intro, but rewrite it to try to make it defensible. If you're looking to develop your conclusion even more, something that you might try to do is to situate the issue in a broader context. So I tried to give you guys an example of that here. So I started by asking myself, was the speech effective? Now, because this is a historical speech, I know that it was effective because we entered World War II. In fact, all the members of Congress, except one, voted for war. So clearly what Roosevelt did was effective. But then I was thinking about it more broadly. Well, there are other times that we've gone to war after being attacked, most notably 9/11. So I wanted to kind of situate this in the broader context of, did that possibly have any influence on future events? Now, let's say the passage isn't necessarily tied to a key moment in history. You could still situate it in a broader context by asking yourself about the implications of the message. So what would happen if the audience does listen to the message? What would happen if they don't? Also, you could ask yourself, how does this message relate to society today? So just kind of try to zoom out a little bit and figure out the deeper significance of the passage itself. If you guys found this video helpful, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button. That genuinely helps my channel grow, which helps me help more teachers and students like you. Also, if you're looking for more information about my upcoming ebook, please be sure to check out the description box below. Until next time, guys, happy writing!